schedule. I'm a little bit concerned that when I have you all meet Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then it might be too much. I mean, when we're in person, we have no choice. We do it. But I'm wondering if it's too much. So I'm not going to ask you today, but later on in the week, I might ask you for some feedback about, you know, because there are ways. It's because we're all online where I can, you know, instead of having us meet on a Zoom, you know, you do something else, or, you know, I mean, we have the discussion board post, so I can substitute a Zoom meeting for something else. But
Yeah.
I also want to maybe, does somebody have a thought on it? No, but I'm like, I want to check because we haven't really had a full week, right, with where we meet Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So let's try that this week and see how it goes. If it ends up being too much, then I will adjust. I'm also getting the sense with the readings is that I do have to adjust that it's a lot of reading, right? No, is it okay? Are you guys handling it all right? Matthew says it's okay. Okay. I'm like, this is where, like, if you don't speak up, then all right, we're gonna assume it's okay. Um, I'm like the next couple of, or the next couple of weeks, it's gonna be a lot. So we'll see if I need to adjust things. Okay. So some of you are doing okay. For some of you, it's a lot. Okay. So then I'm for now I might keep it as it is, but knowing that for some of you it's already a lot, and because it's going to increase next week, then I might have to make adjustments to that. And if I need to make adjustments, I will. I'm trying to not be attached to the material and just be willing to cut things when we need to cut them. So okay, we are in week 4, guys. We're almost a third of the way through the semester. Right. So for week 4, we do have these 2 readings, and in particular, I want to make sure, like, for today's reading was from this book, A Different Mirror. But the reading from Wednesday, it's from the other one, Medical Apartheid. And I really want to make sure that, you know, if you missed class last Friday, that you go back and look at that, because this chapter 1 was from this book again, Medical Apartheid. The reason why you want to pay attention to that is not just because of the discussion board post, which you do have again this week. Hopefully that's just now you're getting in the habit of there's going to be a discussion board post. But next week, at the end of next week, week 5, you have your first paper due. It's about health disparities, right? And so it is primarily based then on the readings from this book, right? So the chapter 1 PDF, and then the chapter from this week, it's going to be chapter 2. So as you're reading those, you want to pay special attention to how slavery was used by the medical field, right? How it's used to develop medicine. So on Wednesday, that's all we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this topic, right? And then why is this history relevant to today? So this paper, again, it's not due this week, it's due next week. I just want, because you're doing the reading for it now, I want you to know the prompt, and that this is going to be a 3 to 4 page paper. It's an analysis paper, so you do have to have an argument, a thesis, paragraphs with an introduction and a conclusion, and as many body paragraphs as you need to answer the questions fully, right? I am going to require citing Chicago style, but I'm going to teach you how to cite Chicago style based on the readings that I'm assigning. Next week, we'll go over it in more detail. I will spend probably half of a class period just talking about how to cite it, because most of you have never even used Chicago style. So I'm going to make it very easy, actually. You basically are just going to have to copy and paste. So that you're doing this first with this first paper is getting a taste of Chicago style. And so that, because most people really only know MLA, so that you have something else that you start feeling more comfortable with. For anybody who's a history major, this is also the standard. We use Chicago style in history. So for the history majors, you have to learn it, because this is our primary form of citation. But let's talk about the reading and the material for today. Hopefully, well, how is it getting a little bit easier? I know the length of the reading might not be getting easier, but he's starting to use less Shakespeare, right? Is it getting a little bit easier to get into or not really? Yes, no, maybe. I need to exit and look at you in the eye. Was the reading for today a little bit easier, or like tell me it wasn't? It's still a little bit too much, or a little okay, a little bit okay. Thank you. A little bit better. One is because you're getting better, right? You're getting better at deciphering what you need to identify as important, what you need to read, and maybe parts where you can skim a little bit. Okay, I'm hoping that it's getting easier. One, because I think he's getting a little bit better in his writing at being clear, but also because you're now it's been a few weeks of you doing this. So let's talk about, well, we're still talking about slavery, but today or this week, I really want to focus on this connection between slavery and capitalism, because a capitalist economic system is developing at the same time that a slave system is developed, right? They are happening around the same time, and really they're interconnected in a lot of important ways, right? One, right, the concept of freedom that is being developed in like what will become the US and in Europe is not meant to apply to everyone, right? This is where slavery is playing a really important role. Because as these concepts of freedom are being instituted, right, as they're becoming part of governments and republics and democracies, they're not being applied to everyone. The only place where it will really apply to most people will be in Haiti, right? But in the republic created in the United States and the one in France, the concept of freedom and equality are just, they don't exist for everyone. It's based on race, right? When the founding fathers talk about freedom and equality, they really mean for white men, right? And even then, right, political rights are not extended to all white men. It's primarily to land owning men, right? Very clearly, though, they are also excluding enslaved people, right? And although there are free Black people in the United States, they are also those rights are also not extended to them, right? One, they do believe that they're in these ideas of racial inferiority and racial superiority, right? They believe that whiteness is superior to Blackness. That is also being influenced by this economic system, right? This triangular triangular trade that is happening in the Atlantic, right? The economies, right, of the slave states in the United States are dependent on slave labor, right? Because this is where they're becoming the world producers of things like tobacco, sugar, like cotton, right? All of that raw material, raw product is being exported outside of the slave colonies. It's all being produced by slaves, though. Then it is being sent to Europe. And really actually for the American colonies, it's being sent to England, right? And so let's talk about cotton, for example, right? The cotton becomes the raw material for the Industrial Revolution, for the start of the Industrial Revolution, right? The first industry to industrialize is the textile mills, right? So making cheap cloth is the first area that gets mechanized and industrialized. What do you need to make cheap cloth? What's the raw material for that? I'm not trying to trick you. What is it?
Cotton.
It's cotton. Yeah, thank you, Serena, and Jacob in the chat. It's cotton, and it's all coming from the American colonies, right? From there, the British are selling their cheap cotton all over the world. They are forcing their colonies to buy back the cheap cloth, by the way. But the cheap cloth is actually being sold everywhere. They're flooding the market with their cheap cloth, which is going to have, it means that Europe is going to dominate the cloth market, right? And so it's all intertwined. It's all intertwined. If you are someone, a business person in anywhere in the Americas, actually, and you're trying to make a lot of money, the way to do that was being part of the cycle. Right? It means somehow you're going to be making your money, or your business is going to be connected to the slave trade, to slave labor. You don't see it as much in the American colonies. In the American colonies, you have a very strict system where even free Black people don't have access to the kind of wealth that like plantations owners are going to be making. But in places like the Caribbean, you end up seeing formerly enslaved people who earn their freedom, right? They escape from the system of slavery and end up becoming very wealthy, usually through owning plantations and owning slaves themselves. And at first, it really looks contradictory, because how can someone who was a slave and has experienced the horrors of slavery then turn around and then own slaves themselves? Well, part of it is, if you want to make money in this system, you have to engage in this economic system. It's so intertwined that it's hard to make money and not somehow participate in this, right, or benefit from it in some way. That's not to say that everybody's doing it, but so much of this economy, right, in West Africa, in Europe, and in the Americas is intertwined with the system of slavery. It's just hard to just, to pull them apart and see them as different, right? Now, here's a map that shows you that, the majority of slaves are being enslaved in West Africa, right? They're not keeping track. Slavers are not keeping track where they're getting everybody. They're really just counting people. I mean, they don't see them as people. They're counting property, right? Bringing them to the Americas. A majority of enslaved people are coming to the Caribbean, into South America. Sometimes in the US, that gets brought up to point out that slavery was harsher in other places of the world. And that's true. You see a slave system that's even harsher than in the American South in places like the Caribbean. Right? But that doesn't mean that it was any better or that it was, that we can justify a slave system in the American colonies. It was still, we're still talking about incredible inequality, a very violent system that we see in the American colonies. I just want to point that out just really quickly. Right now, the reading talked about the North, because most states in the American colonies in the North actually end up developing laws making slavery illegal, right? Their economies don't depend on slave labor, right? They industrialize, the North industrializes, and so they need workers, right? But they need cheap labor, but they don't need that slave labor, right? The plantations in the South need slave labor because that work is so intense, right? So intense, you really couldn't pay people, or they felt they didn't want to pay people enough to actually do that kind of work. But that doesn't mean that the northern colonies are racial havens, right? The reading explains what was the experience for free Black people in the northern colonies. What was it like?
Separated.
Yeah, segregation, right? Oftentimes when we talk about the history of segregation in the US, we focus on the American South after the Civil War. And yeah, right, a system of segregation is institutionalized in the South after the American Civil War, but it was already in existence. Those were not new ideas the South invented. The North, although it didn't have that legal segregation necessarily, had segregation, right? Um, Black communities had to develop separately, right? If a free Black family wanted to live in the white neighborhood, could they do that easily? No, no. I mean, they would not even be able to buy property, right, in a predominant in a white community. What else was happening in the North? Or what? How else can we describe the life of free Black people in the North?
Would the African slave trade be a part of it? Or is it?
So slavery was illegal in the North, and you didn't have slave ships typically docking in northern ports. What ends up happening though is that slaves become aware of that, and they would run away from plantations to the north. And technically, legally, that would make them automatically free. But what ends up happening is they have to pass laws. They have agreements with the southern states saying that if an escaped slave is found in the northern state, they have to return them. So the answer is complex, right? There is no slavery in the North, except it kind of is, right? If a person is found, if an escaped slave is found in the North, they have to be returned, and that's continuing a system of slavery. Yeah, these fugitive slave laws, what's what there were. All right, I'll talk about a few things. So definitely segregation, right? The other thing was in terms of voting rights, right? This is so in the 19th century, we see a process of enfranchisement growing. More and more men gain the right to vote in the northern states, right? To the point where you end up getting universal white male suffrage, right? So eventually in the northern states, all white men, regardless of whether they own property or not, can vote. But for Black men in the North, you had to be property owners in order to participate in the political system, in order to vote. And owning property was incredibly difficult. Right? It was incredibly difficult in those northern states. There were rules, both legal and not legal, that meant that people would not sell to Black families, to Black property owners in the North. Now there were places, right? All right, you're not allowing that, but that still meant that there were Black people who could make money, that were making money. They could start their own towns, start their own businesses. There were thriving Black communities in the North. But what happened to them? This third bullet point, right? We also end up seeing a lot of those Black communities being destroyed, right? Usually by white mobs. White mobs would get together and they would burn down Black communities. They would kill people and they would intimidate them because they believed they didn't want them anywhere near them. Why? Why would white people in the North care about a Black community that was separate? It's separate. They've developed their own community. The white people don't typically were living in those communities. They're different. That seem to fit their rules. They want segregation and they want separation. Okay, Black communities were created separately. Why would they go out of their way to intimidate people, to burn these communities down?
Is it possible because they didn't want to accept that the communities could be better than theirs? And because of their godly superiority complex to always be dominant over others?
Yeah, and Catherine put it in the chat as well. And then I see Almira putting racism, and Serena putting it in there. Yeah, there was, I mean, this is how like prevalent those racist ideas were, right? That whiteness was superior. And so a lot of times there was all this like jealousy around a thriving Black community. And so the mobs would get together to destroy them, right? Yeah, because no matter what, a community that is unchecked can one day be unified enough to take the community over. Yeah, especially when they see certain Black communities like they're growing, they're thriving, they're making money, right? And they're growing and growing. And they're like, wait a minute. You might be growing faster than us. You might be start becoming too powerful than what we might want. And it was just very easy to get these people together and then destroy these communities. I'm like, usually when I ask a question in this class, the answer comes down to racism, and it starts becoming a little cliche, but it's a big deal when you see, okay, you've created this system that means, okay, where segregation's the way we're going to organize things, but then even that's not allowed when a separate community is thriving. It really stands out, right? And so it means that life in the North is not easy, even for free Black people. I think it was Jacob who also put in the chat that getting jobs was hard, and during certain periods especially. Yeah, if somebody needed labor, ideally probably a white owner would want a white worker over a Black worker. Now that might vary by industry, but that would have been very common. That would have been very, very common. Yeah. We see even in urban cities, right? In cities where you had multiracial populations, right? So cities like Philadelphia were growing and thriving, and there was racial diversity. There were riots of the white community against Black people in Philadelphia. They would kill and run out Black people. So I think this is important to make sure we note that that is actually happening. We don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that all the bad things are happening in the Southern colonies and that everything was okay in the North in terms of a race, right? Those racist ideas were so prevalent, right? Even in the North, this idea of interracial marriage, which we spent some time talking about, that's illegal, not okay. All of those thoughts it was still prevalent in the North. It was not just in the South. Right? It was very taboo. Usually, I mean, you do get instances of interracial marriages, and a lot of times the couple needs to be willing to put up with the community rejecting them, or they have to be willing to move out west, where they're not really going to be accepted necessarily, but there's less of that population, so you have more of a chance, basically. There's less population and more of a chance to survive. But this is also why a lot of interracial couples, people might have fallen in love and tried to make a relationship, but ultimately a lot of those relationships would fail. Too much pressure from family and the community, saying that those relationships are not okay. Now, the reading also talked about how plantation owners justified the system of slavery because they had to justify, right? We talked about how since the very beginning of the slave system, people opposed it. And through the 19th century, there's a really strong, in the 18th and 19th century, there's a really strong abolitionist movement that's successful, right? The slave trade is outlawed. It didn't stop it entirely, but the slave trade is internationally outlawed. Slavery still existed and nobody was going to take those slaves away, but it was illegal to bring in new slaves into the colonies. And then there's a big push from abolitionists to end slavery, right? So Southern plantation owners did feel like they had to justify then why they would continue to enslave people. And one of the ways in which they did that by creating these stereotypes of enslaved people. Right? Does anybody remember what the Sambo stereotype was? What was the Sambo stereotype?
Wasn't it like the right hand man slave? Like it was like the number one assistant to like the slave owner.
Yeah, it was this idea that enslaved men were happy as slaves, right? That they were loyal, right? That they were loyal, that you could trust them, right? That the plantation owner could trust them so much that they become the right hand man, that they are actually enforcing the rules in the plantation, right? How accurate was that stereotype?
Not very accurate because some of the slaves would pretend to be loyal and happy just so they can get out of doing most of that hard work that the other slaves would have to do.
Yeah, so a lot of times you will read, when you read like plantation owners talking about their slaves, they're either talking about them as they're slow, dumb, they're like children that need to be taken care of, or you see sometimes them talking about their slaves as they love it. They are not against the system. They're happy. They're getting clothes. They're getting fed. They have work to do. They love it, and they thought that that was actually accurate, right? A lot of times we think that the enslaved person is probably faking it. I mean, I can see that very clearly, right? I mean, some of you fake liking history in here. Or fake liking your professor because you're like, I'm not going to tell them I hate her. Right? Or that I like writing this paper or like the reading, right? That's a survival instinct element, right? Of like this person, this plantation or this slaver owns me. I am their property. And there's a difference in how they treat an enslaved person who looks happy and loyal versus an enslaved person who's causing trouble and is constantly like trying to run away or slowing down work or resisting in some way. So yeah, sometimes there's benefits to playing that role. So we think, yeah, sometimes they probably are seeing that. They're probably hearing from the slave that they're happy. What else is the slave going to say to their owner? You know what? Because what happens if you complain to your slave owner, the slave owner? They're gonna get mad, right? And then your life is in danger. Right? That image too of like slaves liking the system of slavery is completely disrupted when you give people the option. Right? When people had the option. So when there was slave rebellions, right? Like Nat Turner's rebellion, when people had the option of joining a rebellion, guess what? They did it. Nat Turner himself, when he was a slave, his owner described him as happy, loyal, no problems. Nobody anticipated that Nat Turner was going to become a leader of a slave rebellion. Because while he was a slave, he seemed totally happy. Well, that's how he seemed to the slave owner, right? Clearly, that's not how he actually felt. You also see it throughout the Civil War. The minute that slaves on a plantation found out that there was a war going on, that they could join the Union, they did it. If they could, they did it. Okay? And actually during the Civil War, you have a lot of slave owners shocked, super shocked. They genuinely believed that slaves were happy as slaves. Well, I think they had lied to themselves, right? You can't possibly, I don't see how you could think that, but they had lied to themselves about it, and they would be shocked when their slaves would run away to the north in large numbers, because that's what we see during the Civil War, right? This idea though of the happy slave, it was so prevalent, so prevalent. It survives slavery, it survives the Civil War, and even into the modern day, people still have this idea that some slaves liked that system, right? The female equivalent of the samba was the mammy, right? What's the mammy? Someone's putting it in the chat. It's the mom, this idea of this like motherly enslaved woman who, she's a slave, but she mothers all the children of the plantation owner. She takes care of everyone, and she's happy doing it. How real do we think that one is? Do we think that stereotype was actually real?
No, not at all.
Yeah, I don't know. But we see how how that image survives slavery and the Civil War in places like the movie Gone with the Wind, where the main female character, the main Black character, her name is actually Mammy. They don't even try to beat around the bush. Her name is Mammy, and she's very much playing that stereotype of the Black enslaved woman who is happy, who mothers the white children and is taking care of them, and does it because she loves the family. In fact, has anybody watched Gone with the Wind? It's an old movie now. It came out in 1939. And for a long time, it's a classic of American film. And no, so a lot of you haven't seen. Some of you have seen some of it, yeah. So it's based on a book that was written, but then in 1939 they filmed it. It won a bunch of Academy Awards. Usually, it's in people's like top 10, classic American movies ever made. But it's got huge problems because it totally feeds that idea that enslaved people liked slavery, that they hated the Union Army, and that they protected the plantation owners. So I'm going to play you a short clip from the movie. It's just focusing on the Mammy character, and you'll notice how, look at how she can talk back to the white owner, but it's all in a very mothering way. Right? Pay attention to how the Mammy character is mothering the white lady. It was played by Vivian Lee. There we go.
Be the Almighty, most merciful Lord.
Grant us pardon, absolution, and remission of our sins. Amen.
Ooh! Just hold on and suck in.
Mammy, here's for Scarlet's victuals.
You can take that all back to the kitchen. I won't need to buy it.
Oh, yes, you is. You's going to eat every mouthful of this.
Oh, I'm not. We'll put on the dress, because we're late already.
What my lamb going to wear?
That?
No, you ain't. You can't show your bosom for 3 o'clock. I'm going to speak to your ma about you.
If you say one word to Mother, I won't need to buy it.
Well. Keep the shawl on your shoulder. I ain't even for you to get all freckled after the buttermilk I done put on you all this winter, bleaching them freckles. Oh, now, Miss Scarlet, you come on and be good and eat just a little, honey.
No. I'm going to have a good time today. And Do my eating at the barbecue.
If you don't care what folks says about this family, I does. I has told you and told you that you can always tell a lady but the way that she eat in front of folks like a bird. And I ain't aiming for you to go to Mr. John Wilkins's and eat like a field hand and gobble like a hog.
Fiddle-dee-dee. Ashley Wilkes told me he likes to see a girl with a healthy appetite.
What gentleman says and what they thinks is two different things. And I ain't noticed Mr. Ashley asking for to marry you. Now don't eat too fast. Ain't no need to having it come right back up again.
Why does the girl have to be so silly to catch her husband?
Scarlett O'Hara, if you're not down here by the time I count 10, we'll be going without...
I'm coming, Paul!
1, 2, 3, 4, 5...
Oh, dear. My skin is so tight. I know I'd never get through there without belching.
All right, I'll stop sharing. So how so you can see, right? Even the other the slave girl that comes in with like the tray of food, she comes in and she's like with a big smile, super happy. Most of the enslaved people you see in this movie have the biggest smile, super happy, and the idea was that, you know, that was the reality, that's what slave life was like on a plantation, right? What do you think would happen if this movie or a version of this movie like that, having that depiction, would come out today?
It would be canceled.
Immediately canceled. Like, what? Yeah. So somebody else that I see.
The movie Us, but it's more of psychologically, because in that movie, one of the maid, they were smiling, but they were crying, and so yeah, I think that
Playing
kind
with
of
that idea of they're not really happy. Oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen that one. I'm gonna need to.
it's a really good one, like to depict like in a more modern way, but also with a deeper, like, so since this one's kind of like, I wouldn't say it's shallow, but there's more of there's a deeper like meaning into what and how. It's a really good one. I need you to watch it.
I'm gonna need to. I would, yeah. No, and there was actually, so the movie Gone with the Wind came out in 1939. Black groups protested the movie. They did protest the movie because of the Mammy character. They said this portrayal of slavery reeks of racism. And they actually criticized the actress for taking this role, right? Hattie McDaniel was the actress who plays the Mammy character. And she actually won the Academy Award for her role in Gone with the Wind. She was the first Black person to win an Academy Award, right? And to me, that kind of speaks of how much people didn't question that version of the slave system, right? In 1939, it was questioned, of course, but also like most people are totally fine with it. And most people were totally fine with that version of history. It fed that like lost cause image, right? This idea that life in the South was great before the Civil War, right? That it was this idyllic, women wore big dresses, more men were super handsome and like gentleman-like. You see a ton of that in Gone with the Wind. And yeah, there's slavery, but they're happy. that is a key part of this lost cause image of the South, right? Where they define themselves as the victims of the Civil War, right? The plantation, the white plantation owners, which was not. I mean, we're going to slowly be taking apart that image. That image of the happy slave is total bunk, right? It's just total bunk, and it does not make sense in any way. But this is how prevalent that idea was.